The invitation came back unopened. Not torn, not marked returned to sender. Just unopened. The way you'd send back something you'd decided not to deal with. I stood at the mailbox for a long time, holding that little cream envelope with my own handwriting on the front. And I thought, this is what 63 years of living gets you. A letter you sent to your own daughter, returned like junk mail. I should back up. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I raised 2 children on my own after my husband passed. My son was 9, my daughter was 6, and I worked as a home health aide for 22 years to make sure they had everything they needed. Not everything they wanted, everything they needed. There's a difference, and I knew it by the time I was 34 and doing the math on a legal pad at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, trying to figure out how to cover the water bill and the kids' school supply lists at the same time. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter, because that's what she is, married a man named Preston 8 years ago. I didn't dislike Preston at first. He was quiet, polished, had that particular kind of confidence that comes from never having had to worry about money. He called me ma'am for the first 3 years, which I thought was respectful until I realized it was actually distance, wearing politeness like a coat. They settled in a suburb about 40 minutes from me, bought a house that cost more than I'll earn in the rest of my working life combined, and had 2 children, a boy and a girl, my grandchildren. The 2 people on this earth I would do absolutely anything for. For the first few years, things were fine, not warm, but fine. I came over on Sundays when invited. I babysat when asked. I brought food, not because I thought they couldn't feed themselves, but because that's what I know how to do. When someone I love is struggling, I bring food. When someone I love is celebrating, I bring food. My mother did it. Her mother did it. It's a language I learned before I learned words. The trouble started, I think, the way most trouble starts, slowly and then all at once. My grandson was in 2nd grade when he got sick. Nothing life-threatening, thank God, but a persistent respiratory thing that kept him out of school, kept my daughter up at night, kept the whole house in that particular exhausted tension that comes with a sick child. I drove over twice that week without calling first. I brought soup. I sat with him while my daughter napped because she hadn't slept properly in 4 days. I tidied the kitchen because the dishes were piling up, and I could see it was stressing her out. Preston was civil when he came home and found me there, but later, I learned this through my daughter, who told me in that careful voice she uses when she's delivering someone else's complaint. He had said he didn't like coming home to find someone in his house unannounced. I understood that. I did. I told my daughter I'd call ahead next time. And I did, for a while. But then my granddaughter had her spring recital, and I didn't call ahead because it was a school event, a public school auditorium, open to any family member who wanted to attend. I sat 3 rows behind them. I didn't approach. I didn't interrupt. I watched my granddaughter play a little wooden xylophone in a lavender dress, and I cried the way grandmothers cry at those things, quietly and without shame. The next morning, my daughter called me and read from what sounded like a prepared statement. Preston felt I was making them uncomfortable. Preston felt I was inserting myself where I hadn't been invited. Preston felt, and this was the phrase that I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count, that I had a pattern of disregarding their boundaries. I said, I went to a school recital. She said, I know, Mom. I said, she's my granddaughter. She said, I know, but he's my husband. That's the sentence I keep coming back to, not because it was cruel, because it was true, and because it told me everything about the order of things in that house. Over the next year, I tried. I truly tried. I called before I came. I brought gifts only on birthdays and Christmas. I waited to be asked before offering opinions on anything. Their finances, their parenting choices, the decision to put my grandson in a private tutoring program that cost $800 a month when I knew a retired school teacher 2 streets over who would have worked with him for free. I bit my tongue. I kept my hands in my lap, metaphorically speaking. I pay for things when asked. My daughter called 3 times that year when they were short, once for a car repair, once when their property tax bill came in higher than expected, once when Preston's business, he had a small consulting firm, went through a slow quarter. I didn't hesitate any of those times. I sent what I could, from the savings I'd been building since I was 35. Carefully, the way you build something when you know there's no safety net beneath you. I never mentioned it. I never brought it up, because that's not why I did it. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday in March. I remember the day precisely because I'd just come back from my morning walk. 3 miles, which I do every day because my doctor told me it would help with my blood pressure, and because it gives me 45 minutes of quiet that belongs only to me. I was still in my windbreaker. My coffee was brewing. The envelope was from a law firm I'd never heard of, based in the same city where my daughter in Preston lived. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I opened it. The letter was 5 pages, single-spaced. It alleged that I had engaged in a pattern of harassment and unwanted intrusion into their home and private life. It cited the unannounced visits. It cited the school recital. It cited, I am not making this up, the fact that I had rearranged items in their hallway closet during one of my visits. I had been looking for an extra blanket for my sick grandson and had moved things to reach it and then put them back in a different order. It cited this as evidence of my disregard for their personal space. It demanded that I cease all contact with them except through written communication pre-approved by Preston. It was not technically a lawsuit, not yet. It was a cease and desist letter, but there was language at the end about further legal action if I failed to comply. My daughter's name was on it too. I sat with that for a very long time. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing worth anything at this point in my life. Part of me, a small part, understood some of it. I knew I had pushed, sometimes. I knew that dropping by without calling had been a mistake more than once. I knew that when I rearranged things or restocked their pantry without asking, I was, in some technical sense, overstepping. I've thought about that. I've sat with it. But there's a difference between a grandmother making mistakes out of love and a legal document. There's a difference between Mom, please call first, and a cease and desist letter from an attorney. Somewhere between those two things, something had gone very wrong, and I didn't think it was me who decided to make that leap. I called my son. He lives in Phoenix, and we talk every Sunday, and he is, in most ways, the steady one. He listened for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know. He said, "You could just comply. Disappear for a while. Let them cool off." I thought about that. I thought about what disappearing would mean. No contact with my grandchildren. No Sunday dinners. No recitals. No soup when someone was sick. My grandson was 8. My grandson was 8. My granddaughter was 6. Children that age don't understand silence from a grandmother they've known their whole lives. They just know she's gone. I told my son I needed a few days. I spent those days doing something I hadn't done since I was 34 at that kitchen table with the legal pad. I did the math. I pulled out every bank statement from the past 4 years, every transfer I'd made to my daughter's account, every check I'd written, every time I'd said yes when they called. The total over 4 years was just over $47,000. I want to be clear. I am not telling you this because I kept score. I'm telling you this because what happened next required me to understand what was real and what wasn't. And the letter had suggested, in its careful legal language, that I had given them nothing, that I had only taken, only intruded, only disturbed. I found an attorney, not an expensive one. I couldn't afford expensive, but a woman who came recommended by someone at my church, who had decades of family law experience, and who read the cease and desist letter with the kind of calm that told me she had seen this before. "They can send you this letter," she said. "That doesn't mean they're right, and it doesn't mean there's nothing you can do." She explained my options. I could ignore the letter and see if they followed through. I could comply and lose access to my grandchildren quietly. Or I could respond, formally, legally, and let a court look at the full picture. I chose the third option. I want to explain why, because I think people assume this kind of decision comes from anger. It didn't, or it wasn't only anger. It was something closer to the feeling I'd had at 34, Doing the math on that legal pad. When the numbers don't add up, you don't pretend they do. You look at them clearly. You decide what's true and what isn't. And you don't let someone hand you a story about yourself that you know isn't accurate, even if it's easier to accept it. My attorney filed a response. It detailed the financial support I had provided, with documentation. It noted that the school recital had taken place in a public building. It noted that I had complied with multiple requests to call ahead after the fact, and had done so consistently. It requested, formally, that any discussion of limiting my access to my grandchildren be handled by the court, not by a private attorney representing one side. My daughter called me the night after the response was filed. It was the first time we'd spoken in 6 weeks. She didn't sound angry. She sounded tired. "Mom," she said, "why are you doing this?" I said, "Because someone told a story about me that isn't true, and I'd like the truth to be on the record." There was a long silence. "He's not a bad person," she said. He has a hard time with—" She stopped, started again. "He didn't have a mother like you. He doesn't understand it." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't entirely. I understood what she meant, I think. I understood that what I had given freely, without keeping score, had perhaps frightened someone who didn't know how to receive it. That the casseroles and the tidying and the showing up, the language I'd learned from my mother, had read, to someone who didn't speak it, as something threatening. That didn't make the letter okay, but it made it make sense, and sometimes that's the closest thing to comfort you get. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in May. I drove myself. My son offered to fly in, and I told him not to. This was something I needed to do standing on my own feet, or not at all. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. The judge was a woman about 10 years younger than me, with the kind of face that has heard everything and reacts to very little. Preston sat across the aisle with their attorney. My daughter sat beside him. She didn't look at me when I came in. The judge reviewed the filings. She asked questions, precise, unhurried, the kind of questions that tell you someone has actually read what's in front of them. She asked my daughter's attorney to clarify what specific harm had been demonstrated. She asked for documentation of the alleged pattern of harassment. She reviewed the financial records my attorney had submitted. Then she asked Preston directly, had I been present at any private residence without their permission in the past 12 months? There was a pause. His attorney leaned over and said something. Preston said no, not in the last 12 months. The judge nodded. She made a note. She asked about the recital. Preston's attorney began to characterize my presence there as intimidating. The judge looked up from her papers and said, in a tone that was very quiet and very certain, "Counsel, we're talking about a public school auditorium. I need you to give me a legal argument, not a preference." The room got very still. The judge's ruling came about 20 minutes later, after she had stepped out briefly. She denied the request for a formal no-contact order. She stated, clearly for the record, that the evidence presented did not meet the legal threshold for harassment. She noted that the financial history of the relationship was relevant context. She recommended, in language that was careful but unmistakable, that the parties consider family mediation. Then she said something I will carry with me for whatever time I have left. She said, "I want to note for the record that a grandmother attending her grandchild's school performance is not an act of aggression. It is an act of love. The court will not be in the business of criminalizing love." I didn't cry in the courtroom. I waited until I got to the parking lot. The weeks after the hearing were quiet in the way that only things that have been through something can be quiet. My daughter and I didn't speak for almost a month. I went back to my walks, my church, my routine. I cooked things I didn't need to cook and put them in the freezer. Then, on a Saturday afternoon in late June, my phone rang. It was my daughter. She said, "The kids have been asking about you." I didn't say anything. She said, "My son drew a picture of you. He said he wanted to mail it." I said, "He can mail it. I'll put it on the refrigerator." She said, "Mom," and then she stopped, and then she said, "I'm sorry. It wasn't everything. I won't pretend it was everything. We haven't talked about Preston, not really. We haven't talked about the $47,000, and I don't think we will. There are things between us that may take years if they ever fully heal. But she called, and she said she was sorry, and the following Sunday, she brought the kids to my house for the first time in 8 months. My granddaughter walked in the front door and stood in my living room and looked around like she was making sure nothing had changed. Then she walked over to me, put her arms around my middle, and said into my shirt, "Grandma, we missed you." My grandson had drawn a picture of the two of us. He'd gotten taller since I last saw him, taller than I'd expected, standing in front of what appeared to be my house. Though he'd given it a green roof that I don't have and never have had, he said it was because green was my favorite color. Isn't actually, but I told him he was right. There's something I want to say to anyone who recognizes any part of this story, because I know I'm not the only one. I've heard from enough people, over enough years, to know that this particular kind of hurt, being made to feel like a problem for loving someone, is not rare. It's just usually quiet. Here's what I know now that I didn't fully know before. You are allowed to stand up. Not out of anger, not to win something, but because the truth is worth putting on the record. Because your grandchildren deserve to know, someday, that you did not simply disappear, that you fought, quietly, legally, with your hands in your lap and your voice steady, to stay in their lives. And I know something else. On the day of the hearing, while I was sitting in that small courtroom waiting for the judge to come back, I found, tucked into the side pocket of my purse, a folded piece of paper. I didn't know how it got there. I hadn't put it there. It was a drawing, crayon, the way kids do, of a woman with gray hair and a yellow apron, standing at a stove. Underneath it, in shaky 6-year-old handwriting, it said, "I love you, Grandma. Come back soon." My granddaughter had slipped it into my purse the last time she'd seen me, 8 months before. She had known, even at 6, that I might need it. She was right. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. All of it, not just the parts that are easy to tell. What I keep coming back to is the moment I sat at my kitchen table with those bank statements spread out in front of me, $47,000 over 4 years. Not because I was keeping score. I wasn't. But because someone had handed me a story about myself, that I was a burden, an intrusion, a problem to be managed legally, and I needed to know what was actually true before I decided what to do about it. That's the thing about living long enough. You learn that the truth doesn't defend itself automatically. You have to be willing to look at it clearly, name it, and stand behind it even when it costs you something. Even when the person on the other side of the table is someone you raised, someone you'd give your last dollar to without blinking. I made mistakes. I've said that, and I mean it. I showed up without calling. I rearranged things that weren't mine to rearrange. I offered opinions that weren't asked for. When you love people the way I love my grandchildren, sometimes the love comes out sideways. Too much, too soon, too present. I understand now that love without awareness of the other person's experience isn't kindness. It's just need wearing kindness's clothes. But here's what I also know. What my daughter's husband did was a choice, not a misunderstanding, not a cultural difference. A deliberate decision to use the legal system as a weapon against a grandmother whose only crime was showing up at a school recital and dropping off soup. And choices like that have weight. They ripple out. My granddaughter knew it. She slipped that drawing into my purse 8 months before I found it, because even at 6 years old, she understood that something wrong was happening, and she wanted me to have something to hold on to. Children know. They always know. We just spend a lot of years teaching them to doubt what they know. What I want to say to anyone who sees themselves in the story is simple. There will be moments when the right thing to do feels like the harder thing, and the easier thing is just to disappear quietly and let someone else's version of you become the official record. I understand the temptation. I felt it. But I also knew that if I disappeared, my grandchildren would grow up thinking I had chosen to leave. And I had not chosen to leave. I had been pushed, and there is a difference. And that difference was worth fighting for. Integrity isn't something that announces itself. It's what you do in a parking lot, alone, after a court hearing, when no one is watching. It's the decision to tell the truth on the record, even when the record feels like a cold and impersonal thing. It's showing up, not to win, but because showing up is what you do when you love someone. My granddaughter put a crayon drawing in my purse. My grandson gave me a picture of a house with a green roof because he thought green was my favorite color. They were paying attention. They were learning, from all of us, what love looks like when it's tested. I hope what they learned was worth something. I think it was.